for those of you who are veterans of the previous three debates, this will be basically the same format. We will have, I don't even need my notes. We will have, the debate will be in three parts. The first part of the debate, each candidate will have 3 minutes to state what are the key issues facing the next Attorney General of the state of Illinois. Then we will have a question and answer period with the microphone right there. You will line up behind the mic. You will address the question to one of the two candidates. We will go up and back in order. The question, the person who it is addressed to will have 90 seconds to respond. The other candidate will have 60 seconds to respond. We will do that for a period of time until we come to the closing of the debate, where each candidate will have 2 minutes to state why they would be their party's best candidate for Attorney General in November. That is the format of the debate. We have our noted Sergeant of Arms, Ed Mazer, here, in case any of you get rowdy. And he has one eye constantly on the table to my left. And there is a replacement. We normally have Joy Saxon doing the timekeeping, but we made a quick switch to maintain perfect honesty and perfect integrity with these two individuals. We have the French judge flown in from Joy Saxon. There she is. All right, as I was saying, we will start the debate right now. We will have John Schmidt, John, right from there. 3 minutes. What are the key issues facing Illinois' next Attorney General? Mr. Schmidt. Give him a round of applause, please.
Good afternoon. Let me first of all thank the City Club for hosting this debate between the two Democratic candidates for the critical office of Attorney General of the state of Illinois, the chief law enforcement officer of our state. There's never been a time when law enforcement was more important. And I would bring to the job of chief law enforcement officer of our state the experience of practicing law here in Illinois for over 30 years. During those years, I argued before the Supreme Court of Illinois in cases that were critical to the future of our state government. I worked successfully to bring about major reforms in Illinois laws to protect the disabled and other citizens. I led successful efforts to protect the political independence of the Illinois judiciary. At the national level, I've served as the Associate Attorney General of the United States, the third ranking position in the United States Justice Department, with responsibility for directing all criminal and civil enforcement of our civil rights laws and our environmental protection laws and our consumer protection and our antitrust laws. I also directed the federal COPS program that has put 100,000 additional police officers into communities all across this country. This is a time when law enforcement in Illinois confronts crime rates that are starting to rise again and the continuing and unpredictable threat of terrorism. Law enforcement confronts the impact of a recession on working families and the need for strong, aggressive enforcement of laws to protect workers and consumers and pension holders. And law enforcement confronts massive slush funds and spending abuses in Springfield that threaten the basic integrity of our state government. This is not a time for on-the-job training in law enforcement. My opponent has no law enforcement experience and has never directed the investigation or prosecution of anyone for anything. I bring to the job 30 years of law practice and experience as the chief law enforcement officer of this country in directing some of the largest and most successful prosecutions in our history of polluters and price fixers and others who violated our laws. I think what Illinois needs today in a chief law enforcement officer is tested experience in law enforcement to protect the safety and security of communities, to protect the rights of Illinois citizens, and to protect the integrity of our state government.
Do you do an official transfer?
We'll now have State Senator Lisa Madigan, 3 minutes, why she would, what she sees as the most important issues facing Illinois' next Attorney General. Ms. Madigan.
Thank you, Mr. Green. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen and members of the City Club. I believe that the priority of government always has to be protecting, promoting, and providing for children, for women, for families, for the elderly, and for people with disabilities. And I believe if that's what you're looking to do, if you want to make a real difference in people's lives, there is no more important position than being the state's legal officer. Because that's what public service is all about. I bring to this race a record, a proven desire, a proven commitment, and a proven ability to helping people solve their problems and people throughout the state of Illinois to solve their problems. One of the things that we need to make sure we do is to look at the fact that there is work that needs to be done. Here in the state of Illinois, crime is still an issue. Gangs and drugs and violence still plague our communities, and not just in the city of Chicago, but all around the state of Illinois. Domestic violence still harms over 300,000 women and children in the state of Illinois. We have over 2 million people who have no health care coverage at all. And for some people who have health care coverage through HMOs, those HMOs are denying their claims. We need to enforce a patient's Bill of Rights. We have not just seniors, but even the state of Illinois who has to contend with skyrocketing drug prices. And we have to make sure that pharmaceutical companies are providing both the state and seniors with the drugs that they need so they can take care of themselves. We also have an issue where seniors have to contend with consumer fraud, and we have to make sure that they do not continue to be victims. I have a proven record in the Senate of passing legislation to better protect our police officers, to better protect women and children who are victims of domestic violence, and better protect elderly people and people with disabilities from abuse and neglect. I believe that the Attorney General needs to be an advocate for people. I have a vision for the office where not just an Attorney General is going to be working for people in the courts, but also outside of the courts, because the Attorney General should be a lawyer for all the people of the state. Thank you very much.
Okay. Now we will, if you have a question, you know the routine, get up to the microphone, and we will start the question and answer period. Just walk right up. No waiting at the moment. By the way, before we start, just state your name and who the question is to. Yes.
My name is Jennifer Vitas. The question is for Lisa Madigan. Lisa, you made a reference to domestic violence in your opening remarks. Could you elaborate on what you think the role of the Attorney General is and how you, specifically, how you'd address the issue?
Absolutely. I think that the Attorney General has a number of roles in terms of combating domestic violence. As I mentioned, 300,000 women and children face domestic violence every year in the state of Illinois. Here in the state, we have, this is unbelievable to me, but we have 3 times as many animal shelters as we do domestic violence shelters. In 1997, the latest year that I've got figures for, over 16,000 women were turned away from shelters. We have to do 2 things out of the Attorney General's office. One, the Attorney General needs to be an advocate to make sure that there are more resources available for domestic violence shelters, but the Attorney General also has to make sure that prosecutions take place. And we need to change the rules of evidence here in Illinois to allow testimony to be led into trials so that if a woman is unable to testify, we can still prosecute her abuser. And those are things that I'm already working on in the state Senate.
Mr. Schmidt, you have 60 seconds to respond.
Well, I set up at the Justice Department the Violence Against Women Office, which has become the center of a national campaign against domestic violence. I think the Attorney General has to be the leader of that effort in this state. There are a couple things that are essential. One is training for every single police officer in how to respond to domestic violence cases. That's the front line. That's where the law enforcement system first comes into contact with those cases. And having a police officer who knows what he's dealing with can react knows where counseling and other services are available is the first key. The other key is to make certain that there are shelters available for women who need to escape from abusive relationships. The other day I was with some domestic violence advocates, and they said the best estimate is that 10,000 women in Illinois were turned away from shelters last year. Those are women who made it to the shelters. Think how many more needed that kind of protection but didn't have it available because we just don't have the shelters.
Thank you. Now, step right up, state your name, and perhaps where you're from, if you work for a company or another candidate.
My name is Nancy Lindsay.
This is to Mr. Schmidt.
My name is Nancy Lindsay. Identity theft is obviously a major and growing crime, costing individuals, banks, and retailers millions of dollars. What do you think the role of the Attorney General's office is in preventing this crime, and what are your personal views as to what should be done?
Mr. Schmidt, you have 90 seconds.
Well, I share your view that it is one of the major criminal issues confronting this state and this nation. My guess is if we ask in this room how many people have been victims in one form or another of identity theft, at least to the degree of having a credit card stolen or a credit card number taken, we'd find a large percentage of you have had that experience. I think where it really has to start is with protecting access to critical confidential information about consumers. Identity theft is really a symptom of a broader problem, which is the fact that information about us is circulated widely these days without our consent. Companies do it for commercial reasons. Criminals do it for criminal reasons. And what I want to do is make this state the leader in the fundamental protection of the right of every person to consent if they choose, but if they choose not to not have any access to confidential information, whether it's health records, whether it's a social security number, whether it's a credit card number. I think companies in Illinois should be subject to a requirement that unless the consumer, the customer, affirmatively consents, they cannot pass that information on to anyone. I think that's where we really start with the effort to stop identity theft.
Thank you. Ms. Madigan, you have 60 seconds to respond.
Actually, John mentions many of us may have been victims of identity theft. It's happened to me, and I have looked in doing some research. The state of California has some very cutting-edge legislation that I've actually introduced here in Illinois to prevent our credit card numbers from being taken and used against us. But I've also already said that I want to create a Bureau of Privacy Protection to do three things. One, to make sure that the public knows how to protect their identity. Throw away your credit card receipts. Get your credit report every single year to see if there are charges on it that you didn't make. And then if you are, to help the victims, if you are a victim of identity theft, go to your local law enforcement, file a report, send that report to the 3 national credit reporting agencies, and then this bureau should help you sort through so you can figure out how to get your credit back. And that's what I think we need to do, is more proactive work with people in the state.
Thank you. Question for Ms. Madigan.
My name is Harriet Wilson Ellis, and I'd like to know what plans are underway for more focus on addressing abuses that are going on in our penal institutions and corrections, particularly with the need for more treatment for mentally ill people who are in prison and drug addicts.
Thank you.
You bring up a good point, and one of the things that we contend with in our prison system is we're not providing substance abuse counseling and services so that when somebody finishes serving their time, we release them back into a community, and they may not have already had the opportunity to get over the reason they ended up there in the first place. It's also true of the homeless population that we see out on the streets in terms of providing substance abuse services as well as services for mental illness. So one of the things that we need to do is to direct more resources to those sorts of problems, because otherwise we just have a cycle of violence that sometimes occurs because we're not addressing the real issues and the real reason that this is happening to people.
Mr. Schmidt, you have 60 seconds to respond.
Well, I think one of the most serious problems we confront in law enforcement is the people getting out of prisons over the next few years. The numbers are pretty chilling. We sent a lot more people to prison in the early years of the 90s. We sent them for longer sentences, and they're starting to get out. And unless we take the actions that are necessary to enable those people to adjust and find jobs and otherwise live constructive lives, we're really at risk, I think, of a reemergence of a criminal population. drug treatment for every prisoner makes total sense. We should do it. We tried to fund it at the federal level, and the Republicans, for reasons I never understood, wouldn't fund it. They thought it was somehow something we were doing good for the prisoners. Well, maybe it is good for the prisoners, but it's also good for society to end people's drug abuse treatment. So that's a place to start, and we ought to do that in Illinois as an important step.
Thank you. Question for Mr. Schmidt.
My name is Christy Hefner, and as someone who has an affinity with the values and positions of both candidates, I'm particularly interested in how each of you feels you would be able to be successful in the general election should you win the Democratic primary.
I can beat Joe Burkett. I think I can beat Coleman too, but I think it's going to be Burkett. He's going to come on strong. He's a career prosecutor. He's going to say, I've been the state's attorney of DuPage County. And I'm going to say, well, fine, I've been the Associate Attorney General of the United States, with a range of responsibilities that includes the kind of criminal cases that he has brought, but also includes the whole range of other cases, environmental protection and antitrust and civil rights that were my responsibilities at the Justice Department and are the responsibility of the Illinois Attorney General. I think you raise a critical question, because it doesn't do us any good as Democrats to nominate a candidate if that candidate can't win. Burkett has some other weaknesses. He's way to the right on the issue of choice. He is a rabid supporter of the government's right to control what I believe should be the decision by women of what to do with their own bodies. He's also way to the right on the capital punishment issue. He seems to be the only person in a serious position in this state who says, let's start right now resuming capital punishment without even waiting until the Ryan Commission report. So I think he's got some real weaknesses, but if you can't trump him on his issue of experience, I think he's going to be a tough man to beat.
Ms. Madigan, you have 60 seconds to respond.
I love to campaign. And that's really a perverse thing to have as a quality as a candidate, but boy, it's a useful one. I'll be able to stand on my record, and for John to say that I have no experience in terms of crime fighting is simply inaccurate. Long before John had his stint at the Justice Department, I was actually working in the Austin community of Chicago on the far west side, working with police officers to get them back out onto the streets, working with families to create block clubs to take back communities block by block if need be, working in the roll call room of the Austin District Station with children to make sure that they were staying engaged in their education and not becoming involved in the criminal justice system. I've solved problems for people every single day as a state senator for the past 4 years. And that type of experience, I think, gives me a great ability to be the next Attorney General, because people want a lawyer for the people.
Thank you. Question for Ms. Madigan.
My name is John Burnham. I'm a long-term member of the City Club. Senator Madigan, I have a hypothetical question. How would you, as Attorney General, handle a matter similar to the Lemack case? And in particular, do you find any way that case could have been handled better or differently in DuPage County?
Well, as you know, here in the state of Illinois, we've got 102 counties. Each county elects a state's attorney who handles those frontline criminal prosecutions. In terms of how do we handle it better, you're really asking a broad question, I think, about death penalty cases. And so clearly in Illinois, we have a situation where, because we've exonerated 13 people from death row since 1977, we have been unable to fairly implement the death penalty, as well as, it appears, not necessarily able to implement it on a basis that isn't random. And so what we need to do is not only move ahead with the reforms that have already been made by the legislature by putting in place a capital litigation trust fund to provide resources to defense attorneys and to provide resources for DNA testing, as well as making sure the Supreme Court continues on with its reforms, but we also need to legislatively look at the reforms that are going to be suggested by the Commission, put those in place, and then out of the Attorney General's office, I think we really need to take seriously our responsibility under the Illinois Rules of Professional Conduct, not just to prosecute and convict people, but also to seek justice.
Mr. Schmidt, you have 60 seconds to respond.
Well, having said I could beat Joe Burkett, maybe I ought to compliment him on one thing. I thought he made the right decision in not seeking the death penalty in the Lemack case. It just didn't seem to me a case given the nature of the crime and the nature of the person who committed it, that was appropriate for the death penalty. He's got another one on his record, though, that I don't think I would be prepared to give him such high marks for, and that's the Rolando Cruz case, which, as you know, he was the prosecutor in the third prosecution of Rolando Cruz, the least defensible of all those prosecutions, the one that the judge finally called a halt to based on the conclusion that there was perjured testimony. That prosecution went forward after another person had confessed to that crime. And I think that is really a classic case of what's been wrong with the criminal justice system in Illinois.
Okay. Question for Mr. Schmidt.
Ken Dobbs. Mr. Schmidt, there seems to be a tradition at the Illinois Attorney General's office in recent years to defer prosecution of public corruption and public accountability cases to the U.S. Attorney General's office, to U.S. Attorney's office. What, if anything, would you do to change that situation in Illinois?
Well, I would make one fundamental change, which is I would give to the Illinois Attorney General the authority to use a statewide grand jury to investigate and prosecute state corruption. I think that is essential because, as you say, we have relied on the federal government for prosecution of the kind of corruption that put unqualified truck drivers out on our highways, threatening the lives of families and children. We have 102 county prosecutors who, in theory, could prosecute state corruption, but who don't. The problem is we've relied on the federal government, which is now telling us that for the foreseeable future, it is going to devote the vast bulk of its resources to the fight against terrorism. John Ashcroft has said 80 to 90% of the resources of the Justice Department will be used to fight terrorism. We cannot rely, we cannot assume that we're going to have U.S. attorneys and an FBI prepared to commit those resources. I think we've got to step into that void. The state itself and the Attorney General has to take on the job of dealing with state corruption, and the way to do it is give the Illinois Attorney General the power to use a statewide grand jury to investigate and prosecute corrupt activities by state officials or employees.
Ms. Madigan, you have 60 seconds.
During my official announcement speech in early December, I committed to making sure that eliminating public corruption was going to be one of the priorities when I'm the next Attorney General. I think that we have to make sure that any allegations of misuse of public funds, whether it be by Democrats or Republicans, is investigated and is prosecuted if need be. One of the things that we don't have here in the state of Illinois is an Office of Public Integrity, and one of the things that we don't have in the state of Illinois, which I think we absolutely have to have and can be directed out of the Attorney General's office, is ethics training. Ethics training for all elected officials. So we know what the laws are. You're put on notice that if you violate these laws, you are going to be prosecuted. The reality is, in government, we cannot function unless we have the credibility of the public. So we have to make sure that official corruption is investigated and prosecuted.
Question for Ms. Madigan, I'm sorry.
Joel Cohen, CEO of Richard Hoffman Corporation. I'd like to ask, in the job of Illinois Attorney General, how much do you perceive as being legislative versus prosecutorial?
In the job of Attorney General, you have to do both. In fact, you have to be able to multitask. It's imperative that you work with the legislature in terms of directing resources to solve problems, in terms of making sure we have enough money to actually put in place more domestic violence shelters, making sure that we have enough money so that local law enforcement is getting this kind of training that they need to be doing an effective job fighting crime. You also have to make sure that in terms of legislation, we're changing statutes so that we can do better prosecutions. If we want to put in place a statewide grand jury to look into public corruption, we're going to need the legislature to pass that for us. I think it's a good idea, but there's an integral part of being the Attorney General that's legislative, and you can look back historically to see that.
Mr. Schmidt, you have 60 seconds.
The first function of the Attorney General should be to enforce the law. I think people of Illinois have a right to assume that their Attorney General will effectively and aggressively enforce the law. When changes are needed, the Attorney General does need to go to the legislature and seek legislative changes. But legislative advocacy and legislative experience is not a substitute for law enforcement effectiveness and the law enforcement experience that would give the people of Illinois confidence that their Attorney General will enforce the law effectively.
Michael Bauer, I'm a longtime City Club member. One of the issues that's come up in this race, as well as several of the other statewide races, is the issue of member initiative funds. Now, I'm familiar with a lot of the member initiative funds that have monies that have gone to a large variety of social service agencies. Particularly, I'm familiar with a good number of aid service organizations that provide food, housing, medical services, counseling services, variety of services to people with HIV and AIDS. With so much of these funds going to worthwhile social services, why are we demonizing these funds?
There's no question that a lot of good grants have been made through the member initiative process. But fundamentally, the existence of massive lump sum pork barrel slush funds is indefensible and it is unconstitutional. It violates the fundamental constitutional principle that the elected legislature by public appropriation, not one legislative leader or one legislator somewhere in a back room, must determine how public money is going to be spent. And I have said that as Attorney General, I will take action, court action, if necessary, to stop that practice. I'm not, thank you. You know, I'm not really sure where my opponent stands on this issue. She says she's against it now, but she voted for every one of those funds and for every one of those $1.5 billion that have gone into them. And she says she's not taking her money this year, but she took it for the last 2 years. And if I understand her, she's saying she thinks these funds are lawful. That is a fundamental disagreement. The courts have been willing to give a lot of discretion, a lot of flexibility to legislatures in how to spend public money. But when you give $200 million and say, in effect, you can spend it any way you want, and then when the governor turns around and gives that authority back to the 4 legislative leaders, it seems to me you are in fundamental conflict with the basic principles of the Illinois Constitution.
Ms. Madigan, 60 seconds to respond.
I have publicly stated that I am against member initiative money, particularly at a time where we are now with the budget being in a crisis. But here is what I have done with money that has been appropriated to my district. I have requested that $1 million of it be equally distributed to the 30 public schools that I have in my district so that they can put in place programs to improve student achievement. I have requested funding for a daycare center where teenage moms can have their children watched over while they stay in high school. I have appropriated and asked for money to be appropriated to the AIDS Foundation so that they can continue on with the services that they provide to help people. There are good things that happen with member initiative money, but when we are not in a position to fund critical services such as education and health care, I think that we need to be using that money in a different way.
Question for Ms. Madigan. State your name.
Good afternoon. My name is Heidi Biederman. I'm the Executive Director of the Large Unit District Association of Illinois. Senator Madigan, I am aware of your commitment to and advocacy for children through your work as minority spokesman on the Senate Education Committee. How do you think the Attorney General's office can best serve the children of Illinois?
I think that the Attorney General has a role in protecting, in particular, some of our most vulnerable people, and they happen to be children and they happen to be senior citizens. In terms of doing that educational work, again, it is in large part at times an advocacy role. I believe that if we are going to prevent children from becoming part of our criminal justice system, we have to make sure that they stay engaged and involved in their education, and we have to make sure that they then have an opportunity to go on to college, to go on to get themselves a decent job so they can support themselves, their families, live in safe communities. So part of it is an advocacy role in terms of making sure we're better funding education. Another part of it is there are horrible situations going on in people's homes where we have children that are victims of abuse. And we have to make sure that those cases are being prosecuted as they should be, that we're providing resources for the families whose children are being victimized as well. And so the Attorney General has a role to play as an advocate, and the Attorney General has a role to play as a prosecutor to provide training and resources.
Mr. Schmidt, 60 seconds.
One specific thing we should do in Illinois is set up a system of continuing intensive supervision of released child sex offenders. This is an issue that I was involved in at the federal level because I set up the federal child sex offender registry. But that's just a registry. several states around this country have developed a system where if a child sex offender is released, there is continuing intensive supervision. I'm talking about 2-3 times a week, having to report to a parole officer with the use of lie detector tests to make certain that that offender is not resumed any contact with underage children. If you do that, you reduce the recidivism rate by an enormous amount, and Illinois can do that. It costs some money. You got to be willing to pay for the parole officers to do that supervision. But in the scheme of things, in order to protect children from that terrible kind of abuse, that's a very concrete thing, and we should do it now in Illinois.
Thank you, Ms. Peter. Question for Mr. Schmidt.
Hi, my name's Julie Cruz. My question is around welfare reform. Starting July 1st, we're going to have a lot of families in this state whose clocks have run out. And in terms of being a welfare advocate kind of on the front lines, what we see is that a lot of women who are TANF recipients don't know their rights, for example, to education, to educational programs, their rights to enter a construction apprenticeship. And what we've seen in Illinois is that we have succeeded in reducing the welfare rolls, but not in reducing poverty. So as the new TANF legislation comes out federally and Illinois faces this huge problem of people in poverty losing their welfare benefits, what role can the Attorney General's office have, particularly in ensuring that women who are TANF recipients know their rights and know that they can have access to education, can have access to higher wages?
Well, I share your view that it's a very serious problem, and as these limits now really come into place, and as we reach sort of the most difficult families, not the easy ones who early on we were able to move off of welfare rolls and were able to find jobs, we're going to confront a continuing problem. The Attorney General is somewhat limited because issues of funding for the kinds of counseling and other programs which may be necessary are beyond the immediate scope of the Attorney General. I do think that the Attorney General can play a role in advising women in particular of their rights. One thing I would do, and I think my colleague shares this view, is reestablish the regional offices that were established years ago by the Attorney General's office that really provided an opportunity for people to get access to people within the Attorney General's office without having to go to some downtown office or someplace in Springfield. I think those offices might play a particularly useful role in dealing with an issue like how you educate women who are in the circumstances you're describing about just what their rights are, what they do have a right to do or not to do, and where they can get counseling or other services.
Ms. Madigan?
I currently serve in the Senate as the co-chair of the Conference of Women Legislators, and we work on a bipartisan, bi-chamber basis to promote both substantive legislation as well as appropriations legislation to better protect and work with children, women, and families in this state. I believe that what we would need to do when we had a woman as Attorney General is to make sure, you can go ahead and clap, it won't offend me. We need to make sure that the Attorney General takes her role as an advocate seriously. The reality is whoever's Attorney General is going to have a bully pulpit. They're going to have the ability to command, look at all this media attention we've got. We need to get out there and say to women, to make it a story, here are the opportunities that are available, here's the program, here's how it works. You can use the Attorney General's website to provide that information. You can request that legislators provide that information. So you really have to embrace the role as Attorney General, as an advocate, I think, to help this cause.
Mr. Schmidt? Oh, you had it.
Yes,
Question.
My name's Gary Feinerman. What challenges do the events of September 11 bring to the Attorney General's office, and how does your experience equip you to meet those challenges?
Ms. Madigan, go ahead.
You know, the reality is that the world changed on September 11th, and those of us in government and those of us in law enforcement are now in a position where we have to expect the unexpected to happen. Ever since September 11th in the legislature, I have been working with people not just at a state level, but here in the city of Chicago at a city level to make sure that we have the proper resources so that law enforcement has training, so that we have a plan in place. Matt Bettenhausen is really heading most of that up out of the governor's governor's office, but I've been to the 911 center here in Chicago to see what we need to do and to see the sorts of resources that they need. In addition, I have proposed legislation to deal with the potential of a bioterrorist outbreak here in the state of Illinois. We don't want to be in a position where if smallpox is unleashed, and a third of us in this room would find that fatal, where we don't know whether or not we can quarantine people, we can vaccinate people. We need to make sure we have a plan in place and are able to deal with that if it happens here in Illinois.
Mr. Schmidt.
I was at the Justice Department when we developed a response to the Oklahoma City bombing, and then also later to violence at abortion clinics in various states and militia-related violence in the western states. None of those were close to what we now confront. But the one thing that was absolutely clear to me then, and is even more clear now, the federal government cannot do that job alone. Federal law enforcement does not have the resources. There are 12,000 FBI agents. There are 700,000 sworn police officers. The only way to have the kind of proactive, on-the-ground intelligence and information gathering that is needed is to have a level of cooperation, coordination, and communication between federal, state, and local law enforcement beyond anything we have seen before in this country. That's why I've said that as Attorney General, I would establish and personally lead a statewide working group of police and prosecutors from around the state to coordinate our own effort, but then most important, to be a vehicle for coordination with the federal government. I do believe that having been at the highest levels of federal law enforcement, I have a unique resource to bring to bear in developing a
Mr.
degree
Schmidt,
of cooperation
your time
that
is
is
up.
critical.
Okay. State your name. Definitely state your name.
My name is Dennis Gannon. I'm with the Chicago Federation of Labor. My question is to Senator Madigan.
No, it's
but
to Mr. Schmidt.
Mr. Schmidt, it's your turn, so I
All
guess
right.
we're going to go first with you because I believe this question will probably be answered, hopefully it'll be answered the appropriate way. But my point is this. What type of agenda,
Doesn't get
what
any
type
better.
of agenda will you as the Attorney General put on the burners for working men and women in the state of Illinois? And will we, as working men and women, have a voice in your office?
Well, to take the second first, as you know, I've committed to have an active liaison working together with organized labor throughout this state to deal directly with issues that are of importance, particularly to organized labor. I intend to be the best Attorney General in Illinois history in enforcing aggressively the laws to protect the working men and women of this state. I'll give you a concrete example, prevailing wage laws. I'm not sure we really enforce prevailing wage laws today. Somebody who gets caught basically ends up having to do what they should have done in the first place. So there's no real deterrence. I've said a number of times, I think it's probably necessary to send somebody to jail for violating the prevailing wage laws. Robert Morgenthau in New York, probably the best state prosecutor in this country, did that. You don't have to do it very often, but it sends the message that these laws are serious. And I think an aggressive Attorney General with the kind of experience to be a tough prosecutor in dealing with prevailing wage laws and other similar laws can make a real difference in really enforcing laws that have been on the books for a while.
Ms. Madigan, 60 seconds.
I have been working for the working men and women of the state of Illinois as long as I've been in the legislature and even longer than that. I have already put out my labor and employment plan, which says that we will recreate a prevailing wage unit in the Attorney General's office. And I will start an employment counseling initiative. This is work that I did in private practice, and I think that employees as well as employers need to know what their rights and responsibilities are under the employment laws here in Illinois. In addition, I have committed to creating a labor liaison as well as a labor advisory council so that all the unions have representation and that they can alert us in the Attorney General's office to the problems. With all due respect to my opponent, I do believe that it's very difficult to stand here or sit here and say that you're going to have a commitment to the working men and women when you've spent 30 years in corporate practice doing mergers and acquisitions work and not working for the men and women of the state of Illinois.
Question for Ms. Madigan. State your name, sir.
My name is Bill Marovitz. When I was in the Senate of Illinois, I sponsored and passed a piece of legislation creating safe school zones in the state of Illinois so that the public and private schools in Illinois would be a safe haven for learning, not a place for the gangs to operate and deal drugs and weapons and use weapons. I think the law has been underutilized up to this point in creating a safe haven for learning. How would you, as an Attorney General, both of you hopefully, answer the question, utilize this legislation to enhance penalties and to transfer people to adult felony court for prosecution for these drug and weapons-related crimes around our schools.
Ms. Madigan.
Senator Marovitz, let me commend you for all the fine work you did in the Illinois Senate when you were there, because that wasn't the only issue that you were a real leader on. Here's the reality again. We need to make sure that we've got local law enforcement and state's attorneys that know what they can do based on the laws that are already on the books. And so if that means that we have to provide them with resources and we have to provide them with training, then we should do that. Oftentimes you have local law enforcement, particularly in the city of Chicago, who have many, many things to do, and we have to make sure that they're making schools and school safety a priority. I get requests as a senator from the schools that I go to visit in my district, can you please have the Chicago Police Department just have a squad car available when school gets out? You know, Paul Vallis likes to say that we're very lucky that here in CPS that there hasn't actually been a shooting at a school, but there have been plenty of shootings around and near schools. So obviously there's work to be done to make sure that our children are safe. In addition, I think we need to fund more after-school programs to keep our kids engaged and involved, keep them after school so they're not out on the streets getting involved with the gangs and getting involved with crime.
Mr. Schmidt.
Well, there's obviously no higher priority than the safety of our schools. One of the things we did in the community policing program was to target efforts to enable communities to put police officers into schools where the school boards and school authorities thought that was necessary. One of the problems we're facing, I think, in Illinois, and it's around the country, the demands of 911 are putting demands on our local police forces that are causing them to back away from some of those efforts, like stationing police in schools, stationing police out in communities. I think it may be that we're going to have to provide some supplemental assistance to police departments around this state, particularly targeted on police departments that are running into real financial problems in sustaining their level of resources in the face of 911. And not having the resources to deal with school violence seems to me one where, you know, in the scheme of things, in a $50 billion a year state budget, we should be able to find the resources to enable communities to protect the safety of children in schools.
Thank you. State your name.
Thank
Question
you.
for Mr.
Tom
Schmidt.
Balanoff, Service Employees International Union. There are currently tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of people living here in Illinois who go to work every day and work hard. They're active in their communities and their schools. They're good citizens in every way except their legal status. And I'm concerned as to both of you, your role as Attorney General, what you'll do to protect workers and residents from exploitation at work and in their communities because of lack of legal status.
Well, I think that there are obviously a lot of good people who are living in our state who are not citizens. We confront at the moment the particular danger that they will become targets of some form of discrimination, falsely based upon the notion that they have some role in the terrorism that has occurred or that might occur in the future. I think probably the most important thing the Attorney General can do in that area is to educate people. I thought Rudolph Giuliani did a magnificent job in the wake of 9/11 in getting across the message that this is not an opportunity or an occasion and should not be taken by anybody as a reason to be going after people who are lawfully in this country who don't happen to be citizens. And I think an Attorney General of the state of Illinois needs to follow along in that tradition and make certain that people understand that. There's nothing illegal about being a non-citizen, and there may be people who are even in the process of becoming citizens. And to the extent those people become vulnerable, for example, to people who prey on their ignorance of laws with respect to the practice of law, which is an area that we have seen a serious abuse where some people have convinced people that they are in fact lawyers when they're not. I think in those areas you need aggressive law enforcement and send a message. We're not going to tolerate abuse of anyone in our country, whether they are a citizen or not.
Ms. Madigan.
Thank you, Mr. Green. Here's what I think we need to do. We need to make sure that we don't have people who are working in unsafe conditions and people who are working in sweatshop conditions. And the reality is, in the state of Illinois, that goes on right now. I have spent time meeting with labor leaders on this very issue, and there's a way that we can actually define and determine what do we consider to be a sweatshop. We've got to do those investigations because even if people are not citizens, they have rights too. They should not be treated as slave labor. And so I believe that out of the Attorney General's office, when we enhance the visibility of the Labor and Employment Unit, and when we start to actually enforce our labor laws, as opposed to having somebody in there who is only beholden to corporate special interests, being beholden to the people's interests, will demand that we get in there and we eliminate these unsafe conditions for people who are working here in the United States and here in Illinois.
Excuse me, you're on the clock.
Jeff Berkowitz, host and producer, Public Affairs, every Monday night, 8:30 p.m., Channel 21.
This question is to Ms. Madigan.
Senator Madigan,
Jeff Berkowitz.
nice to see you.
A pleasure.
It's really for the two of you, but let me focus very quickly on Senator Madigan. We'll mention something as to Mr. Schmidt. And
Does he
that's
get
your
to do
question.
a bifurcated question?
No, he doesn't, but his time is running out.
All right, issue of conflicts. The Tribune mentioned last Sunday that if there were an investigation about your father, Speaker of the House Mike Madigan, you would recuse yourself. But nobody said, what about the people close to Mike Madigan? Would you recuse yourself? As to those people, how would you delineate when and where to recuse yourself? Where's the conflict? John Schmidt, you know, you worked for the mayor. He didn't endorse you, but you got a lot of friends in the Democratic Party. Same question. When would you recuse yourself from those close to you in the past for an investigation against them?
Yeah, there are laws here in the state of Illinois that determine conflicts and allow for a system for us to figure out when something is a conflict and when it is not a conflict. Now, what I have said publicly is that if there is an allegation or an investigation that needs to be done of my father, I will absolutely recuse myself. If need be, we'll turn that over to the U.S. Attorney's Office. But we all obviously have relationships. You know, if Joe Burkett becomes the Attorney General, is he going to recuse himself from situations with Pate Phillip or Lee Daniels? So everybody brings relationships, and I have been very clear that in terms of integrity, I will not participate in an investigation of my father. Somebody else will handle that. As for everybody else, I have clearly stated as well that if there is any allegation of misuse of funds, whether it be Democrats or Republicans, that's going to be investigated and prosecuted if need be.
Mr. Schmidt.
Well, there's no higher item on my agenda as Attorney General than to investigate the abuses in the member initiative slush funds that have taken place. If I understand my colleague's position, it's that she would disqualify herself in a charge against her father directly. But all the other funding, which was the result, at least in the House, of her father's allocations, she would not disqualify herself. It seems to me that the people of Illinois have a right to make a judgment about whether in those circumstances, when you're being asked to investigate spending, which the Speaker, who is your father, was responsible for, you're capable of investigating aggressively, fearlessly, and in an uninhibited way. I would come to that office with a determination to be absolutely fearless and aggressive in pursuing that trail of abuse in that funding wherever it may lead. I believe unless we do that, we're not going to restore confidence in the integrity of the state of government of this state.
Okay. A question for Mr. Schmidt. We're going to have three more questions. This one and perhaps two more. So we're in the home stretch.
My name is Carol Wyatt, and I'm coming to ask a question about gang violence. How important is that as an issue for the Attorney General's office, and what will you do about it?
Schmidt.
Well, I actually think if you look at those beginning to rise crime rates, which are disturbing, the big factor there is gang violence. We're starting to see a resurgence in gang violence. I think the Attorney General has a very important role there in leading a statewide effort against statewide gang activity. If you travel around this state, one of the things you learn is the gangs do not follow any jurisdictional lines. They don't limit themselves to Chicago or to Cook County. The same gangs, literally the same gangs, are operating in Cook County and out in Will County and down in Champaign-Urbana and in Decatur. And I think the Attorney General should lead a statewide effort using the statewide grand jury authority, which he does have when it comes to statewide gang activity, but also coordinating and communicating and bringing police and prosecutors together so we can pursue those cases in the most effective way. One other thing we need to do, we need intensive supervision of released gang members, whether they're out of prison or on probation, to make certain that they do not resume gang activity. That's been done in other states. We can do that in Illinois, and that would be a very important step in preventing a resurgence in gang activity.
Ms. Madigan.
One of the reasons that we have not seen the murder rate get reduced here in Chicago is because of the gang violence. I have said that one of the things that I think we need to do is to use the statewide grand jury's power with the money laundering statutes to start to cut off the funding for the gangs. It's the same as that we're trying to do at an international level in terms of trying to cut the funding off from terrorists. We've got terrorism going on in our communities in Chicago and statewide. We can use the statewide grand jury to curtail some of that. We need to keep on making sure that the kids that are on the street are getting picked up, but we need also to make sure that the people who are never touching the drugs, never touching anything, never having to get their hands dirty in this whole process, no longer get the money. If we follow the money and we prevent that from happening, the gang violence will have to diminish and eliminate because we'll start putting those people in jail. I've been working with the Chicago Project for Violence Prevention for a number of years now. They are working very seriously on reducing gang violence with the ceasefire operation, and I'm hoping that that's going to also eliminate our problems with gang violence.
Step right up. We only have time for 2 more questions. I'm sorry. You guys could fight out who asked the last question. Go ahead. You're okay. You're okay.
Thank you. Chris Cleveland. I apologize in advance for this question. It's a tough one, but
This is the City Club. There's no need to give a mea culpa beforehand. There'll be plenty of people screaming at you if it's really bad afterwards. Don't worry
okay,
about it.
good.
Just shoot it out.
I'll be out the door very quickly.
Okay.
A question to both candidates: is nepotism a problem in the state of Illinois or in Cook County?
All right, everyone make your comments. No.
You have 87 seconds more.
Well, stop taking my time then. I sit and stand before all of you running on my record, running on the fact that I have worked in communities, that I have worked with the Chicago Police Department, that I have worked with senior citizens, that I've spent 4 years serving in the Illinois Senate. I have a proven record to run on. And as I will say in my closing remarks, people need to look beyond my last name. If I thought I was only running because of that, let me tell you, I got better things to do with my time and my money than to run around the state of Illinois for somebody else. I'm doing this because I sincerely believe that we need an attorney general who's going to be a lawyer for the people, and I think I've got the skills to do that.
Mr. Schmidt.
I don't think nepotism is an issue. I think experience, qualifications are an issue. I do think voters should look hard at both of us and decide who they believe brings to the chief law enforcement officer's position in this state the kind of experience that would give voters confidence that that job will be done well. As I said earlier, I bring 30 years of law practice. My opponent has been out of law school for 8 years, with I guess 4 years of actual full-time law practice. I bring service at the highest levels of federal law enforcement, prosecuting some of the biggest, most successful cases in this country's history. And I would repeat, my opponent has, as far as I know, never directed the investigation or prosecution of anyone for anything. So I think those are differences that matter, and I think people should look at each of us on our merits and judge us.
Schmidt. Last question to Mr. Schmidt.
My name is Alex Polikoff. Mr. Schmidt, I know you've played a role personally in security, neighborhood crime issues in the near west side of Chicago. I'm not convinced by what you and Ms. Madigan have so far said about the role of the Attorney General specifically. Based on the neighborhood crime gang issue that both of you have referred to, and we're talking about a statewide office, would you explain specifically what role the Attorney General can play in carrying out the kinds of neighborhood security issues I know you personally have been involved in on the west side?
Mr. Schmidt.
Well, the issue that, the effort that Mr. Polikoff is referring to is for the last 3 years, I've chaired a group called the West Haven Security Working Group, which brings together police officers from 2 districts that cover the Henry Horner Homes area in western part of the city, resident representatives, community representatives. We've come together, actually, we used to meet every 2 weeks. Now we meet once a month. And we've had a remarkable success. There hasn't been a single homicide in that area in 3 years. The reason is because the police and the community are working together. How do we make that happen at the state level? I think we do it in part by providing the resources so that police throughout this state will be able to commit their time and effort to that kind of effort. In the case of the West Haven group, we literally had the district commanders of the 13th and 12th districts at every one of those meetings, virtually every one, for 3 years. The other thing I think the Attorney General has to do is send the message that that's the only thing in the end that can really make the difference. We still need the tough prosecution of the gang leaders with the statewide grand jury. We still need the tough supervision of released gang leaders, but we also need the community working together with police at the local level to deal with the preventive efforts that in the long run are what will prevent a resurgence of gang activity.
Ms. Madigan, you have 60 seconds.
One of the things we need to do is make sure that community policing strategies that are successful are being communicated to other law enforcement officials around the state. So frequently you do have a situation where state's attorneys come together, where the county sheriffs come together. Use that as an opportunity to make sure that that information is getting out there. The Chicago Project for Violence Prevention that I've been involved with has been very successful in terms of trying to put in place ceasefire zones around the city of Chicago and some of the highest violence communities. They've also been successful in terms of making sure that we bring together clergy and we bring together community organizations. We put in place after-school programming. So I think it's an advocacy role, and I think it's a resource role, and I think it's making sure that strategies are being communicated to other areas of the state so that we can reduce the violence that's going on, not just in Chicago, but around the rest of the state.
Very good. We now come to the third part of the debate, the last part of the debate. By the draw, Mr. Schmidt drew number one, so he goes first. He will have 2 minutes on the question why I would be my party's best candidate for Illinois Attorney General in November. Though this question was asked kind of earlier, fully address it. Mr. Schmidt.
Beyond any positions on particular issues that we've talked about, I think the thing I would bring to the job that is probably most important is a deep conviction of what law enforcement is all about. In my view, law enforcement is not about technicalities. It is not about words on paper, whether those are court decisions or statutes. Law enforcement is fundamentally about values. It's the way we enforce and give reality to the values of our community. One of those values is the right of every person to be judged as an individual without discrimination on the basis of race or color or creed, which is why strong enforcement of our civil rights laws is so important. One of those values is the teaching that I think we learn in every one of our great religions, that in the end, we're judged by how we treat the most vulnerable, the least powerful of our citizens, which is why it is so important to have strong enforcement of laws to protect our elderly from fraud or abuse, or our children from exploitation, or those of our fellow citizens who are physically or mentally disabled. And the most fundamental value is the right of every person in every community to live in peace and security without fear of violence. That is the value that is violated when crazed terrorists fly planes into skyscrapers. It's violated when gangbangers fire guns at sidewalks and kill innocent children. And in every case, our response should be the same. We need strength in law enforcement that will match the strength of a common conviction that violence is unacceptable, and we will protect our families and our communities.
Thank you, Mr. Schmidt. Round of applause, please. Ms. Madigan, we'll give you a loose 2 minutes to respond.
Excellent. Ladies and gentlemen, as I've said from day one of this race, I will put my record of public service up against anyone's. And I urge you to look at my record, to look beyond my last name. Pick up the phone, call Senator Paul Simon, ask him about the work that I did for him in Washington, D.C. Call the president of Georgetown University, Jack DeGioia, who ran the program when I was over in South Africa as a volunteer high school teacher in the 1980s during apartheid. You can talk to officers and commanders that I worked with on the west side of Chicago when we were pioneering community policing strategies in the late 1980s and early 1990s. You can talk to my colleagues at Wright College, where I worked as the assistant dean of adult and continuing education to set up programs so that seniors would be re-engaged with education. You can talk to people from Loyola's Law School, right over there, Dean Appel, who's waving, about the work that I did as the executive editor of the Consumer Law Reporter. You can talk to my colleagues at Sacknoff and Weaver, and you can talk to my colleagues in the Senate about the work that I've done to pass legislation to better protect people. In addition, I want you not just to look at my record, I want you to look at my plans for the Attorney General's office. And I want you to look at the vision that I have for the Attorney General's office. Because I sincerely believe that the Attorney General should not just be out there enforcing the laws, but needs to be an advocate, needs to be a lawyer for the people of the state of Illinois. Thank you.